The boardroom of Astoria Capital shimmered with polished glass and quiet tension. Floor-to-ceiling windows looked out over New York's skyline, but no one was admiring the view. The air was thick with expectation, and in the center of it all sat a leather-bound folder, its contents worth over $4.2 billion. A historic merger between Astoria Capital, one of the oldest financial firms on the East Coast, and Selvyn Holdings, a rising but notoriously aggressive private equity firm, was about to be sealed. CEO Preston Vale, once known for his analytical sharpness and risk-averse leadership, leaned forward slightly in his chair. His fingers tapped the edge of the table in a rhythm betraying nerves he hadn't shown in years. It wasn't just the size of the deal, it was the pressure from within. His wife, Camille Vale, stood beside him with practiced elegance, eyes fixed on the stack of contracts like a lioness over prey. As a major shareholder in Astoria, Camille had lobbied relentlessly for the merger, calling it the future of legacy wealth. She had also vouched, repeatedly, for Victor Selvyn. Victor Selvyn himself was already halfway through his glass of Bordeaux. Dressed in a tailored navy suit with a rose-gold tie clip, he smiled with the smooth confidence of a man who'd rewritten countless contracts mid-signature. Everything about him exuded charm and danger in equal measure, an operator who rarely heard the word no and never left a paper trail of blame. Downstairs, far from the boardroom's glint and glamour, 16-year-old Imani Clark wiped down the elevator doors with practiced precision. She moved quietly alongside her mother, Harper Clark, who had worked the night shift at Astoria Capital for nearly a decade. Most of the executives didn't know Harper's name, let alone her daughter's. They were invisible, as expected. But Imani's mind was never idle. Every evening she accompanied her mother to work, bringing a worn legal notebook in her bag, filled with annotations, contract terms, and sketches of clauses from real documents she had discreetly read or memorized. No one knew she had once placed first in a citywide legal logic competition for high schoolers. No one knew she could spot a liability loophole faster than most interns at Sullivan and Cromwell. Imani had learned early that brilliance without access was like a blade without a handle, sharp but dangerous to hold. She never resented her mother for scrubbing the walls of power. She admired her. Harper had given up everything to raise Imani alone after her father disappeared. In return, Imani studied the language of contracts the way others studied TikTok trends. And now, as they finished mopping the hallway leading to the 47th floor, Imani noticed something unusual. The printer next to the legal team's door hummed softly. A set of documents had been left inside, pages still warm. With a glance to make sure no one was watching, Imani reached out and slid the top sheet toward her. Her eyes scanned the words quickly. Indemnification waiver, transferal of liability, binding authority clause. Her pulse quickened. Something felt off. She'd seen a clause like this before, in a case study about a tech firm that had gone bankrupt after being baited into a similar merger structure. She slipped the page back just as Harper called her from around the corner. But the words clung to her like static. Upstairs, they were preparing to sign a deal that could make or break generations of wealth. And yet none of them would ever imagine that the janitor's daughter might understand the contract better than anyone in that room. Imani didn't know it yet, but within 24 hours, she would walk into that boardroom. And the moment she spoke, the glass walls of Astoria Capital would no longer shield secrets. They would shatter. The hum of fluorescent lights echoed through the empty corridors of Astoria Capital late that night. Harper Clark moved methodically through the 47th floor, wiping down countertops and polishing the glass conference table, while Imani, sleeves rolled up and notebook beside her, quietly waited in the break room corner. It had become their unspoken routine. Harper cleaned, Imani studied. But tonight was different. The printer outside the boardroom had jammed again, its screen flashing red. Imani stepped out to help, as she often did when no one else was around. She opened the tray, cleared the jam, and retrieved a crumpled batch of papers left unattended. Her eyes, trained by months of careful reading, caught the heading immediately: Merger Contract, Astoria Capital and Selvyn Holdings. She scanned the pages quickly, heart skipping, when she reached Section 9B, Liability Transfer Clause. Her breath caught. The language was buried in legal jargon, but its meaning was unmistakable. In the event of post-merger failure, Astoria would absorb full responsibility for financial losses and regulatory violations. Selvyn Holdings would retain immunity under the advisory provision written just below. Amani's fingers trembled as she reread the paragraph. It was a trap, a sophisticated, technically legal maneuver designed to shift risk entirely onto Astoria while protecting Selvyn. She had seen a nearly identical structure in a past case study, a merger that had collapsed, leaving one party bankrupt and the other untouched. This clause didn't belong in a deal of this size, not unless someone wanted Astoria to fail. She tucked the page into her notebook and said nothing. Not yet. By mid-morning, the Astoria Capital boardroom was alive with tension. The directors sat in tailored suits around the gleaming table. Camille Vale stood near the far window, her gaze fixed on Victor Selvyn, who exuded calm satisfaction. Preston Vale was seated at the head, contract open before him, pen poised. "Ladies and gentlemen," Preston began, clearing his throat, "we are moments away from securing Astoria's place in the future." The double doors opened suddenly. Heads turned. Amani Clark stood at the entrance, holding her notebook tight to her chest. A security guard moved to stop her, but Preston raised his hand. "Let her speak," he said, frowning. "I'm sorry," Amani began, voice steady despite the room's weight. "But you're about to make a mistake that could cost this company everything." Whispers rustled like wind. Camille's eyes narrowed. Victor arched a brow, amused. Preston's expression shifted from surprise to incredulity. "I found a copy of the contract you're about to sign," Amani continued. "And in Section 9B, under liability transfer, there's a clause that ensures if anything goes wrong, Astoria assumes full financial and legal responsibility. Selvyn Holdings walks away untouched." "That's absurd," Victor cut in smoothly. "That clause is standard protective language. It's a firewall," Amani snapped back, "and it's designed to collapse only on one side. Yours remains untouched. The way it's written, even a regulatory breach caused by Selvyn would be Astoria's burden." Preston stared at her, stunned into silence. His hand hovered above the signature line, suddenly uncertain. Camille broke the tension. "And who exactly are you?" "I'm Amani Clark," she replied firmly. "Daughter of Harper Clark, your night janitor, and someone who understands contracts better than whoever buried that clause in your paperwork." For a long second, no one moved. Then Preston lowered his pen. The deal was no longer certain, and neither was the future of those in that room. The silence that followed Amani's bold declaration was quickly shattered by outrage. Camille Vale took a sharp step forward, her stilettos echoing against the marble floor. "This is preposterous," she barked, voice slicing through the boardroom air like a blade. "Who let a janitor's daughter interrupt a billion-dollar deal?" She turned to Preston, disbelief darkening her expression. "This is a secure board meeting, Preston, not a debate club for high school interns." Amani stood her ground, clutching her notebook against the sneering stares. Camille's glare shifted to her. "You polish windows. Don't pretend you can read through contracts written by legal teams with Ivy League degrees. This is legal minutia, not something your little hobby prepares you for." Victor Selvyn chuckled softly, hands in his pockets, his voice dipped in honeyed calm. "Let's not get emotional, Camille." He turned to Amani. "What you're referring to is common liability shielding language. Every major merger has it in some form. It's nothing scandalous, just legalese." Several board members snorted, visibly amused. One leaned toward another and whispered, "Probably trying to go viral. Kids these days." Another added, "She probably heard a few buzzwords on YouTube and thinks she's Erin Brockovich." The air thickened with condescension, but Amani didn't flinch, her eyes locked with Preston's. "Mr. Vale, have you reviewed Selvyn Holdings' previous acquisitions in the last 6 years?" She flipped her notebook open, revealing printed headlines. "Because I have. 3 companies filed for bankruptcy within 18 months of merging. Each time, Selvyn Holdings exited untouched, citing similar liability transfer clauses buried in the agreements." Victor's smile flickered. "In the Polaris Tech deal," Imani continued, "Selvyn claimed they were only strategic advisors. The clause made the target company responsible for fines after the SEC investigation. Over 800 jobs lost. Coincidence, Victor replied quickly, his charm faltering. Different circumstances entirely. Iron Grid? Same pattern. clauses nearly identical in structure, and in clearly pharma, Selvyn sold off assets right before the lawsuits hit, thanks to pre-cleared immunity baked into their merger contract. These aren't coincidences, they're a pattern, and your lawyers just planted the same trap here. A murmur rippled through the room. One of the older board members, skeptical until now, began typing on his tablet. His brow furrowed as search results filled the screen. "Mr. Vale," he finally said, voice low but firm, "she's telling the truth. I'm looking at a leaked deposition from the Polaris bankruptcy. The language mirrors what's in Section 9B, word for word in some parts." The boardroom shifted. No longer amused, many now wore unease like freshly ironed suits gone damp. Camille's fury deepened. "Enough," she snapped. "This child and her mother are not authorized to be here. Security!" She spun toward the door. "Remove them, now." 2 guards stepped forward. Harper, who had been silent near the back, took a protective step in front of Imani, her expression unreadable. Preston raised a hand, not to stop the guards, but merely to pause. His face remained a mask, unreadable. "We're not going to sign anything today," he said after a moment, voice steady but without looking at Imani. Meeting adjourned. The directors shifted uncomfortably. Some glanced toward Camille, who pursed her lips but said nothing. Victor said nothing at all. Imani looked to Preston, hoping for some acknowledgement. None came, just a quiet nod to the guards who now stood frozen, unsure whether to act. Harper touched her daughter's shoulder. "Let's go," she said softly. As they walked out of the room, Imani's heartbeat pounded. Not from fear, but fury. She hadn't come to play hero. She had come to speak the truth. And in that glittering tower of power and profit, truth had made everyone deeply uncomfortable. But it had also planted a seed. And Imani Clark wasn't finished yet. In the days following the disrupted board meeting, Preston Vale found himself unable to concentrate. The echo of Imani's voice, clear and unnervingly precise, continued to haunt the halls of his thoughts. What disturbed him most wasn't that a 16-year-old had exposed a fatal flaw in a multi-billion-dollar contract. It was the possibility that she was the only one who hadn't ignored it. That night, alone in his penthouse office, he pored over the merger's documentation. Not just the final version, but early drafts, old correspondences, and committee memos. Hours passed. Then, in a long-forgotten subfolder buried under compliance notes from 6 months earlier, he found it. A flagged report from the Legal Risk Committee titled Clause 9B, Precedent Risks and Advisory. It was unambiguous. The memo explicitly warned that similar liability transfers had been linked to multiple collapses in other deals involving Selvyn Holdings. The report outlined potential fallout, regulatory scrutiny, and reputational damage. Preston's eyes scanned the digital signature at the bottom. Jonas Reddick, Chief Legal Counsel. His brows furrowed. Reddick had left abruptly shortly after that document's date, or rather, he had been removed. Preston leaned back, jaw tightening. The report hadn't been included in the final board packet. Instead, a sanitized legal summary had replaced it. And the person who had authority to filter what made it into the board's final review? Camille. The next morning, as Preston weighed his next move, something even more unexpected happened. Imani received a message request from an unknown contact on a secure app she rarely used. The sender's name blinked across her cracked phone screen. Jonas Reddick. Her fingers hesitated before she tapped accept. The man on the video call had a weary face and a cautious tone. His background looked like a quiet home office, lined with books and scattered legal pads. "I heard what you did in that meeting," he began. "Imani, right? That was brave and necessary." "Why are you contacting me?" she asked carefully. "Because I tried to stop a deal just like this 2 years ago. I wrote a risk memo. It never made it past the executive filter." His eyes darkened. "A week later, I was dismissed for performance issues after 22 years with the firm." Imani's heart pounded. "Did it involve Selvyn Holdings?" He nodded. "And the same language, that Clause 9B. I warned that it could financially devastate Astoria. I was told it was above my pay grade to question it." "Camille?" Imani guessed. "She and Victor have a longer history than most people realize. There's more than business between them, I'm sure of it." "Why are you telling me this now?" Reddick exhaled slowly. "Because people like you, who aren't afraid, are rare. And I want the truth to be heard. I still have my original files. If this goes public, it could stop the deal for good." Meanwhile, back at Astoria, Preston was playing his own game of chess. Something in him, dulled over years of corporate posturing, had been stirred by the uncomfortable clarity Imani brought into that boardroom. He could no longer pretend neutrality. Too much was at stake, and someone was lying. He returned to the office archives and requested securities access logs from 2 months prior, around the time the contract drafts had been finalized. Then he asked IT to provide document version histories from the internal server. What he discovered was subtle, but damning. There had been a quiet update to the merger file, timed late at night, logged under a proxy user ID linked to Camille's executive assistant. The metadata aligned with the exact day after a private dinner Camille had hosted for Victor. But it wasn't just digital footprints Preston found. It was something far more dangerous, a recording. Tucked in the archive of internal call logs, Preston unearthed an encrypted backup folder from the compliance division. Inside was a flagged audio file labeled simply, Redline Discussion, Camille Victor. He clicked play. Victor's voice came first, smooth and confident. Just slide it into subsection C, use standard legal phrasing. By the time they realize, it'll be post-signature. Then Camille's voice. No one reads that far unless someone's looking to cause trouble. Preston won't. He hasn't in years. Victor chuckled. Then we're safe, until someone goes snooping. Then let's just pray no one's bored enough to dig that deep. Preston hit pause, bile rising in his throat. There it was. Proof. Not only had Camille knowingly concealed the clause, she'd conspired to insert it under the radar. The trust he'd placed in her, personally and professionally, had been manipulated, and Victor had played them both. He leaned back, staring out the floor-to-ceiling windows of his office, the city glittering below, unaware of the corporate war brewing above. The game had changed. Camille and Victor had planned the perfect checkmate, but they hadn't accounted for Imani Clark. It was time to reset the board, and this time, Preston Vale would not be the fool in the game. The morning after his discoveries, Preston Vale moved swiftly. The sun hadn't fully risen over Manhattan's skyline when he arrived at Astoria Capital, but his mind had been racing through the night. He summoned 3 people to his private executive boardroom, Imani Clark, her mother Harper, and Jonas Reddick. Also present was Nora Wen, an independent corporate attorney known for her fearlessness in white-collar investigations. Imani sat in quiet disbelief, glancing at her mother whose eyes, though tired from the graveyard shift, were brimming with questions. Jonas greeted Nora curtly. They had crossed paths in legal circles, but never on the same side. Preston stood at the head of the table, holding the printed transcript of the damning audio file. His voice was steady as he addressed the group. I owe some of you apologies, he began, looking toward Imani. And others, thanks, but now we focus on the facts, and on justice. He laid out the timeline of events, the buried legal memo, Jonas's forced resignation, the manipulated clause, and the audio file. Nora listened, scribbling rapid notes. This isn't just corporate deception, she said, tapping her pen. It's fraud. A planned misrepresentation to board members and shareholders. There's enough here to pursue both civil and criminal action. Imani's heart pounded. She had expected maybe a quiet withdrawal of the merger. Not this. Not formal legal proceedings against one of the most powerful couples in New York finance. But Preston was resolute. We're not negotiating, we're exposing. They began constructing the case that day. Jonas provided corroborating emails. Nora's team reviewed board communications. Imani, with her uncanny memory, helped match timestamps to changes in the contract drafts. The file thickened with every passing hour. But Camille Vale was not one to go down quietly. By evening, news broke on a financial gossip site. Imani Clark, teen whistleblower or talented faker. The article cited anonymous sources claiming Imani had never actually won her legal analysis award and that her academic records were suspiciously inaccessible. A few hours later, a right-wing outlet ran a piece titled CEO's Wife Targeted by Cleaning Lady's Daughter in Corporate Hit Job. Harper found out first. As she entered Astoria for her night shift, security stopped her at the door. Her clearance badge had been revoked. I'm sorry, the guard said awkwardly. New orders. You're on administrative hold, pending internal review. The humiliation stung worse than the job loss itself. Back at home, Imani's social media exploded with hate. Some called her a fraud, others a plant. Commenters accused her of weaponizing race for attention. Strangers flooded her inbox with threats, mocking her neighborhood, her school, her family. Harper tried to comfort her, but Imani was silent, staring at her cracked phone screen, the pixels flickering with cruelty. That night, Preston received an encrypted folder in his private inbox. It contained surveillance footage from Camille's assistant's office, days prior. It showed Camille speaking directly to a PR strategist, approving a digital smear campaign. The goal was clear. Make the girl radioactive, she said. Discredit the whistleblower, and everything she touched crumbles. Preston forwarded the footage to Nora. The next morning, the team met again, this time with renewed urgency. This is war, Nora said plainly. Camille's targeting a minor to protect corporate theft. We need to escalate. They filed a formal complaint with the SEC and submitted a parallel dossier to the Manhattan District Attorney's Office. Within hours, regulators contacted Preston for an emergency briefing. Jonas testified under oath that his termination had been retaliation. Imani signed a sworn statement detailing her discovery and the abuse that followed. Preston himself volunteered all internal records, including the hidden audio file. He made no attempt to shield the firm from consequence. This happened under my leadership, he told investigators, and I won't hide behind title or legacy to excuse that. Meanwhile, Nora moved swiftly to secure a restraining order, preventing Camille and Victor from contacting or defaming Imani further. Harper's termination was reversed within 24 hours, following a legal threat that made HR departments across the building freeze with dread. In a closed-door board session that Friday, Preston addressed Astoria's directors. We face a moment of reckoning, he said. We can pretend this didn't happen, or we can rebuild this company in the image of what we once aspired to be. The board voted unanimously to suspend Camille from all official duties and revoke her voting rights pending litigation. Victor Selvyn, learning of the criminal referrals, quietly left the country on his private jet. But Imani, still in her school uniform, stood firm. I didn't mean for any of this to happen, she told Preston after the vote. I just couldn't let you sign something that would destroy people's lives. Preston looked at her with a new kind of respect. You didn't cause this, Imani. You prevented it, and now we'll make sure no one forgets that. The grand boardroom of Astoria Capital had never hosted a hearing quite like this one. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the Manhattan skyline, but inside, all eyes were focused not on the view, but on a 16-year-old girl sitting calmly behind the witness table. Imani Clark, still in her modest blazer and navy skirt, looked neither nervous nor cocky, just resolute. The internal tribunal had been convened following the rapid escalation of evidence. Contracts, emails, audio recordings, and retaliatory attacks. What had begun as a private business negotiation had now turned into a corporate scandal spilling into the public eye, with press camped outside and shareholders demanding accountability. The boardroom buzzed with subdued tension. Lawyers flanked both sides of the polished oak table. Preston Vale, no longer seated at the head, watched quietly from a lower chair. Imani was sworn in. The silence was absolute. She began not with anger or accusation, but with clarity. Her voice, while soft, cut through the air with precision. My name is Imani Clark. I am 16 years old. I don't have a law degree or a financial title, but I do have facts, and the truth matters, no matter who delivers it. She raised a printed copy of the merger contract and flipped to the section titled Liability Transfer. This clause, she pointed, exempts Selvyn Holdings from any responsibility if the merger fails. All burden of debt, legal dispute, and regulatory penalty would fall squarely on Astoria Capital. That would destroy the company. You were about to sign it. She paused, then played the audio recording. The room filled with Camille's unmistakable voice. Just switch the clause before the board sees it. Nobody reads that fine print anyway. Followed by Victor's. And if someone does, we bury them in PR damage control, gasps echoed. A few members of the board leaned forward, stunned. Imani continued, laying out case law on corporate fiduciary duty. She referenced the Sarbanes-Oxley Act and highlighted the ethical obligations of executive officers. This isn't just a mistake, she said calmly. It's manipulation, intent, and violation. Camille's attorney objected, calling it a juvenile misreading of corporate strategy. But when Nora Wen, the independent counsel, took the floor to validate Imani's legal analysis, the room shifted palpably. Facts overruled status. Jonas Reddick was next. The former head of legal, once forced out quietly, returned with firm conviction. He described how his concerns about Victor's influence had been suppressed. He confirmed that Camille had overridden risk reports and scrubbed internal audits from board review. By the time the final piece of evidence, an internal memo misdated intentionally to mislead regulators, was read aloud, the board had heard enough. The vote was swift. Camille Vale, indefinitely suspended from all board and executive positions pending federal investigation. Victor Selvyn, declared persona non grata by the company, with all contracts and merger discussions terminated and referred to the Department of Justice. The documents were immediately dispatched to the DOJ's Corporate Crimes Division. A formal statement to the press was prepared. And for the first time in Astoria's 100-year history, a teenage girl had out-argued billionaires in their own arena. Preston stood before the board one final time. His expression was one of weariness, but also humility. "I failed," he said plainly. "Not just in oversight, but in trust. I ignored warnings. I allowed influence to cloud judgment, and I let a toxic alliance risk the soul of this company." He turned to Imani. "If not for your courage, we would have signed our own demise. For that, I offer not just thanks, but my resignation." He stepped down without protest. No golden parachute, no press conference, just a quiet exit from the company he had once hoped to preserve. The shareholders, many of whom had come in angry and uncertain, were now unified. They voted to dissolve the current executive board and form a new governance body. One built on transparency, accountability, and inclusion. Among the first directives, to offer Jonas his position back, and to formally invite Imani to join the company's Ethics and Youth Advisory Panel. The girl who had once been mocked for carrying her mother's cleaning supplies now carried the moral compass of an entire corporation. Outside, the crowd had grown. Reporters clamored for statements, flashbulbs burst against the windows. But Imani didn't rush to the spotlight. She simply held her mother's hand, nodded politely to Preston, and walked out with her head held high. In the months following the internal tribunal, Astoria Capital began to rebuild, not only its financial standing, but its integrity. With the termination of the merger deal, the company narrowly escaped a collapse that would have crippled its future. Shareholder confidence gradually returned as transparency measures were introduced, and a new board was appointed with a mandate to uphold ethical governance. But more than charts and numbers, it was a cultural shift that took root within the glass towers of Astoria. At the center of this transformation was a program born not in a strategy room, but from the courage of a teenage girl once dismissed as invisible. The Clark Initiative, named in honor of Imani and her mother Harper, was formally announced 6 weeks after the hearing. Designed to identify and support underprivileged high school students with an interest in law, finance, and corporate ethics, the program offered mentorship, internships, and, most importantly, full scholarships to top universities. For the first time, access to Wall Street wouldn't be reserved for those born into its shadow. Imani didn't attend the launch ceremony to boast or pose for photos. She stood quietly in the back row, holding her mother's hand, just as she had the day she left the boardroom. But this time, the name Clark wasn't whispered with disdain. It was applauded with respect. Word of her bravery spread far beyond New York. Legal associations invited her to speak. Ethics panels asked for her perspective. And when Yale University announced her acceptance with a full scholarship, majoring in ethics, politics, and economics, the news made headlines nationwide. Preston Vale, now retired from executive life, retreated to a quieter purpose. In his Upper West Side apartment, he wrote a memoir titled The Girl Who Read the Fine Print. Far from a redemption arc, the book was a confession, a warning, and an homage. He detailed how he had lost his way, how ambition had dulled his judgment, and how a teenager's insistence on truth reminded him what real leadership demanded. The final pages were dedicated to Imani. He didn't call her a hero, he called her a compass. Astoria's headquarters also bore the change. Etched into the lobby's marble wall beneath the company's name, new gold lettering shimmered in the morning sun. Truth reads between the lines. And below it, in smaller type, simply, In honor of Imani Clark, visitors stopped to read it. Employees walked past it daily. Some touched the letters for luck, others for clarity. And as the fiscal year closed, with the company stronger, more diverse, and more grounded than ever, there was a sense that something greater had been won. Not just a battle against corruption, but a belief that even in places built to silence certain voices, one voice, clear, unwavering, and uninvited, could still change everything. If you believe that courage doesn't require a title, and truth can come from anywhere, even the back of a janitor's cart, share Imani's story. Let it remind us that justice isn't about who speaks the loudest, but who dares to speak when it matters most.